From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the legacy and impact of the Arab Spring 10 years on. Starting with the death of a street vendor in a small town in Tunisia at the beginning of 2011, the protests and uprisings of the Arab Spring spread across the region from Tunisia to Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, among other countries, reshaping politics and toppling long-standing leaders. In the years that followed, the trajectories of these uprisings would turn out very differently. Only in one, Tunisia, has a democratic transition taken hold, while others have seen darker outcomes, from authoritarian repression to civil war. On today's program, we'll be taking a closer look at 4 of these countries, each of which I'll be discussing in a separate segment with a different scholar, starting with Tunisia and including Egypt, Yemen, and finally Syria. I hope you enjoy today's program. First up on the program, we'll be talking to Sabina Henneberg about Tunisia. Sabina is an adjunct professorial lecturer at American University's School of International Service, an expert on transitional governments, and the author of the recently published book, Managing Transition, the first post-uprising phase in Tunisia and Libya. Sabina, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tunisia was where the Arab Spring first began on December 17th, 2010, when Mohamed Bouazizi, a fruit and vegetable seller, lit himself on fire in a small provincial town. His death on January 4th, 2011, unleashed a chain of events that led to national protests and uprisings first in Tunisia and then across the region. Sabina, take us back to late 2010 in Tunisia. Where did things stand, and why did the death of a street vendor resonate so powerfully and spark a movement that would ultimately unseat the country's longtime president?
Well, by December 2010, when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in the town of Sidi Bouzid, President Ben Ali had been in power already for 23 years. And it should be noted that when he seized power in November 1987, he seized it from Habib Bourguiba, who had become president at the end of the French protectorate and who himself had been in power for about 3 decades. So several generations of Tunisians had only ever known this kind of authoritarian or strongman rule. There had been economic growth under Ben Ali, but it was marked by severe inequality, with the interior regions like Sidi Bouzid suffering high levels of poverty and unemployment, while the capital city and coastal regions benefited. And this inequality was coupled with a harsh human rights repression, such as the curtailing of freedom of expression, and the granting of broad powers to internal security forces who frequently practiced torture against critics of the regime. And at the same time, Ben Ali kept a tight control over the media. So people both inside and outside the country were unaware of the conditions in places like Sidi Bouzid and the other interior regions. They were unaware of the ways that when residents in those regions would try to stand up and demand respect for their rights, these efforts would be harshly repressed. And importantly, Western countries tended to turn a blind eye to this kind of human rights repression and the inequality because Ben Ali was instituting the kinds of neoliberal economic policies they were promoting, and because he was promising to keep a lid on terrorism, which these Western countries were worried about. So these were the conditions that had been created under the Ben Ali regime, and then certain events leading up to Bouazizi's death are thought to have helped kind of fuel people's anger, like the WikiLeaks publishing of cables from the U.S. Embassy revealing its awareness of this kind of inequality and human rights repression and revealing the extent of corruption within the Ben Ali regime.
Looking back now, a decade on, what do you see as the long-term impact and legacy of the Arab Spring in Tunisia?
Well, I think we could point to 2 positive long-term impacts of those uprisings of January 2011 that brought down Ben Ali regime. First, I think it's really important to recognize the progress that has been made in Tunisia in moving away from authoritarian rule. For example, things like freedom of expression and also free and fair elections, which were non-existent before, are now actually in place. And importantly, in 2014, the country adopted a new constitution, which has been hailed as the most progressive in the region. And then, in my eyes, another very significant mark or impact of that revolution in Tunisia is just the sheer courage of the people and the sheer courage it took to overthrow a dictator of 23 years who practiced systematic torture against its citizens. So I think Tunisians are right to be proud of their revolution, and I don't think that they will easily let go of what they have attained.
Do you think Tunisia should be seen as an outlier within the region? To what extent is it similar to or different from other states? And how did this affect the differing Arab Spring outcomes?
Well, the aspect of the attempted political transition in Tunisia that I've studied and worked on the most is the way Tunisians dealt with the immediate period after Ben Ali left, but before any new political system was in place. This was an extremely chaotic period, and lots of decisions were taken that may have set the country on a difficult path. For example, decisions around transitional justice, like the disbanding of the ruling party of Ben Ali, but allowing some of its members to continue to be involved in politics. So decisions like this may have helped facilitate the reappearance of old regime figures in the following years. Or as another example, the immediate period following Ben Ali's ouster was when the first steps were taken to create what became the Truth and Dignity Commission, which did conduct important investigations and hearings into past crimes. But the creators of that commission could not prevent it from becoming heavily politicized. But more broadly, decision makers during that very early period, who incidentally were legal or constitutional scholars, so with profiles not unlike the current president, and they were also human rights activists and political opposition figures, that group of decision makers were by and large very committed to true democratic reform. And I think their efforts really helped in both the immediate term and the longer term in preserving at least a modicum of stability in Tunisia. So in that way, Tunisia was really blessed, I think, with a core of people who were able to play this role, also by setting a precedent of people or groups of different political philosophies actually working together for the betterment of the country. But their role in the longer transition process was very limited, and their work still risks being undone by individuals who don't necessarily have the country's best interests at heart.
You've also done work on the transition in Libya, and I'm curious how you would kind of compare and contrast those two examples.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is just that, as I mentioned, I don't think Libya was blessed in the same way with this kind of core of activists or legal scholars who had been sort of preparing themselves for thinking about democratic reform in the way that happened in Tunisia. So a lot of what I'm referring to as early decision makers in Libya came back from outside the country with sort of not having been involved in things for several decades. Of course, as you know, a big difference between the two countries was the violence that sort of broke out as a result of the revolution that just added to the huge challenges that Libyan decision makers in that early period had to face. So those are some of the first things that come to mind in terms of contrasting the two cases.
Moving forward to the present day, instead of celebrating the 10th anniversary of Tunisia's revolution, in recent weeks, the country has seen ongoing protests as youths have taken to the street to voice their discontent with the government. On a practical level, how much have things changed over the past 10 years for regular Tunisians? And are things any better now than they were a decade ago?
Well, in economic terms, I think a lot of Tunisians do not see the revolution as having brought positive changes. Persistent levels of high unemployment and also high debt levels are the two big examples of economic challenges that the government or governments since 2011 have not managed well. And the economic inequality that I was speaking about before has also not been adequately addressed. And then in the same vein, corruption and abuse by security forces, which were two of the darkest features of the Ben Ali regime, are still present. And we have seen some of this on display in the recent unrest. So in general, widespread resentment and mistrust of the government are still there. And then in terms of belief in democracy, I guess a lot of Tunisians are more active and involved in politics now than they were before, especially young people. And there has also been a flourishing of civil society over the last 10 years, civil society activism over the last 10 years. But naturally, Tunisians are many Tunisians are disillusioned with this concept of democracy because of the instability in government that they're observing and because of politicians' frequent refusal to work together or to adhere to democratic ideals. So in sum, I don't think most Tunisians feel that their day-to-day lives have improved much.
Looking ahead, how do you see things developing going forward? What are your expectations for the 15th or the 20th anniversary of the revolution?
Well, there are a few positive indicators or metrics, like the decline in terrorist attacks in Tunisia since 2015, and the increase in the number of terrorist arrests. But this, let's call it progress, appears to be coming at the cost of excessive powers for security forces and restrictions on freedoms like those that existed during the Ben Ali era. In several ways, the country appears to be having trouble sort of shedding itself of these kinds of tendencies. Ultimately, until stability in national level politics is achieved, it will be difficult to undertake the necessary economic and judicial reforms. And so this could lead to negative outcomes like dramatic decline in political participation or in civil society activism, both of which would be big blows to the building of democracy. On the other hand, maybe young Tunisians will become so fed up with their leaders that a new generation of politicians with a truly different mindset will emerge.
Any final thoughts before we conclude, Sabina?
Well, I guess I think the case of Tunisia really shows that 10 years is not a very long time to build an entirely new political system, especially a democratic one, or to overcome the trauma of decades of human rights abuse, or heal social cleavages that were previously kept beneath the surface. So I'm glad those of us who care about democratic transition and who care about the Middle East and North Africa are still paying attention to Tunisia. But I also think it's important not to be too quick to hold it up as a model for the rest of the region. There's a long way to go before Tunisia is a country where the majority of people are really thriving, but we should keep up our support and do what we can to help move that process forward.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we'll be speaking with Dr. Sahar Khamis about Egypt. Sahar is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland College Park and a non-resident scholar with MEI's cyber program. She's an expert on Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the Mass Communication and Information Science Department at Qatar University. Sahar, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Following the overthrow of the Tunisian government in mid-January 2011, protesters began to gather in Cairo's Tahrir Square on January 25th, demanding the resignation of longtime Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Sahar, what was the atmosphere like in Egypt in late January? And when did you begin to feel that things were different this time around, that this was more than just another protest?
Well, this was a very important, emotional, historic moment for me as an Egyptian citizen, for sure. When we started to see the streets filling up with protesters, we were like, is this really going to go beyond just a few hundred people gathered here and there? Or is it going to go bigger than that? Because I'm sure you know that there were protests in Egypt before. The January 25th, 2011 protests broke up in these huge numbers in Tahrir Square and elsewhere in Cairo and other parts of Egypt and other parts of the Arab world. There were also protests before that. I always say it was not like the Arab world was sleeping or Egyptians were sleeping and suddenly they woke up in January 2011. There were protests, but on a small scale, the Kifaya or Enough movement in Egypt, the April 6th movement, but they always were in hundreds of numbers, just hundreds of people gathered here and there. It was easy for the police to round them up and just put them behind bars and to just abort the whole thing. This time I felt the momentum was growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and we started to have high hopes and expectations. Is Egypt gonna, follow in the footsteps of Tunisia? Are we gonna see something a lot bigger than what we have witnessed, before? And we started to really see Tahrir Square filling up. And when it reached like 1 million people gathered in Tahrir Square, that was the aha moment, right? That was the moment when we said, well, this is really gonna be different this time. And then the momentum started, of course, to grow and grow and grow, and to really spread in other parts of Egypt. And I always remind people, it's not just in Cairo; it was also in other cities and other even rural areas and other many different cities and towns all over Egypt and many parts of the Arab world. So I felt like this was really very different this time.
I remember sitting in my living room in Istanbul, where I was living at the time, watching hours and hours of coverage of the protests and being utterly transfixed. How important was media to the story of the Arab Spring and the Egyptian uprising in particular?
Media was very crucial, very important for sure. I mean, when we talk about media, obviously you're talking about different types of media. There is the mainstream media, which in many cases, in many parts of the Arab world, Egypt is no exception, is pretty much controlled by the regimes in power. But you also have satellite television, and these were obviously really giving a completely different picture, a completely different story to the rest of the world. So I remember watching, the national state Egyptian TV, and then watching Al Jazeera and seeing two completely different worlds. You watch the first one, you see just the very calm Cairo and the beautiful Nile. It looks very romantic, very peaceful. And then you go out to Al Jazeera, and then you see, people being hit in Tahrir Square. You see protesters clashing with the police. It was a completely different image. So obviously, satellite TV played a very important role. But then there was also the role, of course, of digital media and social media, which is the bulk of my research, really focusing on the role of cyber activism or the usage of social media and new media for the purpose of promoting political and social change and transformation in this part of the world. And of course, it's no there's definitely no question that they played a very important role in the midst of these uprisings, so much so that some people even started to label these uprisings after the names of certain social media. So for example, they called the Egyptian revolution the Facebook revolution, the Tunisian revolution, the Twitter uprising or the Twitter revolution, the Syrian uprising, they call it the YouTube uprising. And of course, I have an issue with these types of labels and these types of names, because at the end of the day, it's always the people on the ground who make the change happen and make the revolution succeed and make the uprising work. It is never the role of social media per se.
When it comes to the use of digital technology, things like blogs and the social media platforms that you mentioned, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, what would you say was the kind of experience in Egypt? What were the kind of limitations of what cyber activism could and couldn't achieve?
I would say for sure that these social media platforms played very important roles. The fact that I mentioned that, we cannot label these revolutions Facebook revolution or Twitter uprising does not also mean that they did not play an important role in certain aspects. For example, Facebook was excellent in terms of networking, creating certain groups like We Are All Khalid Saeed Facebook group, which is a very important group that was really one of the triggering factors, so to speak, behind igniting the flames of the Egyptian revolution of 2011. It really started to catch fire and started to have hundreds of thousands of followers, and even to start to spill over into the realm of on the street activism and protest, which was very important linkage between the online and the offline, so to speak. You also have the Twitter. Twitter played a very important role in terms of on the ground coordination and organization. There is a book called Tweets from Tahrir, which is available online, that talks about how the protesters and activists were documenting everything that was happening and taking place on the ground, minute by minute, on Twitter through their own tweets. So that was very effective in terms of coordination, organization. Don't go to this street. This is full of police. Go to another, area. Don't bring this with you. Don't bring your ID. Bring a lot of water. This area is very dangerous. It was minute by minute documentation and also organization and coordination. YouTube, of course, was excellent in terms of documenting everything that was happening. Take, for example, the example of a country like Syria. If it had not been for YouTube, we would have no clue what was happening inside Syria, because as we know, foreign correspondents and journalists were denied access inside Syria. So if it had not been for the protesters and activists and citizen journalists bringing these videos and smuggling these videos and then uploading them on YouTube, we would have no idea what was happening inside a country like Syria. So they played a number of very important roles. I just want to be careful that we don't slip into the problem of technological determinism, which means overcrediting social media and digital media in terms of these uprisings, but that should not also make us belittle or diminish the role as well.
Unlike Tunisia, which we discussed earlier in the program, the situation in Egypt ultimately went in a very different direction, with the rise and fall of Mohamed Morsi, the coup of July 2013, and the presidency of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Looking back on it now, a decade later, what do you see as the long-term ramifications? What's changed in Egypt and what hasn't?
Let me just start by saying that people had very high hopes and expectations back in 2011, right? 10 years ago, we really had a lot of high hopes and expectations, not just for Egypt, but for all the six, Arab Spring countries. And unfortunately, things did not go as planned. So out of these countries, only Tunisia had the positive experience of a smooth transition to democratization based on peaceful coalition building and peaceful alliance building and really being able to have an active civil society, a model, in my opinion, that should be followed by other countries to really watch the Tunisian example and say, maybe we can try to mimic or follow these very successful steps that were taken in Tunisia. The rest of the Arab Spring countries, of course, as we know, did not have the same fortunate outcome. In fact, the outcomes were pretty much disastrous. We have the horrible civil war in Syria with a terrible humanitarian crisis and huge number of refugees and all of the atrocities going along with it. Yemen, of course, with the war and the complete collapse of the infrastructure and more than 110,000 people already dead in this very much tragic situation. You have, of course, Libya, also the sectarian strife and becoming completely a stateless state. And you have, of course, the Bahrain, which is really the invisible or forgotten revolution that nobody talks about, that has been crushed, from the very start. And then you have the Egyptian experiment of really going back, not just to the situation that existed pre January 25th, 2011, to the Mubarak era, but to a much, much more stifling of freedoms in general, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, all types of freedoms are now in a much, much worse situation than they were prior to the eruption of the Egyptian revolution back in 2011. I think the main lesson here to be learned is really that it's easy to oust a dictator from office, as we saw in the case of, for example, of Mubarak in Egypt, but it's much harder to realize what to do next. What can you do next after you really oust this dictator from office, right? This is a completely different story. If you don't have a vision, if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a roadmap to the next steps, what are you going to do next? Then you can really go down a slippery slope and things can go from bad to worse, as witnessed in these other five Arab Spring countries, of course, the only exception being Tunisia.
Moving forward to the present, what do you see as the most pressing challenges facing Egypt today?
The most pressing challenges are really too much. We have the problem of polarization and fragmentation. The historic golden moment that we witnessed in the midst of the Egyptian revolution of 2011, when Egyptians were pretty much united. You saw Muslims and Christians, Islamists, secular, men, women, rich, poor, you name it. People were all together in this unique historic moment of solidarity and really having common goals and just chanting, Irhal, Irhal, saying to Mubarak, you must go, you must go. This moment really, unfortunately, has disappeared and it has been replaced by a very dangerous phenomena of deep, deep divisions and fragmentation and polarization to a very damaging degree. The reason it is very damaging is because people lost trust in each other. They cannot trust each other anymore and they cannot see things eye to eye anymore. And that's a very dangerous thing because once this happens, you start to give the others labels. You start to stigmatize them. So you call this person, oh, you are the Muslim Brotherhood. Oh, you are a terrorist. Or you are an extremist. Or you are, a traitor. And once you start to do that, and once you start to go down this very dangerous slippery slope, and you lose confidence and trust in others, these very deepening of polarization and fragmentation is really a big hurdle. It's a very big obstacle in terms of building successful coalitions or alliances like the ones we witnessed in the successful Tunisian case. You cannot build these alliances and coalitions once you start to label others with these horrible labels and stigmatizing them like that. This is a very dangerous phenomenon. So I think that the Egyptian civil society definitely has a lot of work to be done. There is definitely a vacuum in terms of civil society activism. There is a vacuum in terms of having organized opposition. There is a vacuum in terms of having really some kind of unification of an agenda that can be unified, an agenda that can be united for all the different oppositional groups. All of that, unfortunately, does not exist. And it really creates this big question of what comes first, right? It's a chicken and egg question. Do you need to have an active civil society in order for democracy to prevail and succeed? Or you need democracy to prevail and succeed in order to have an active civil society? And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to this $1 million question, but it's a very important one that should be asked.
Indeed, it's a hugely important question for not just for Egypt, but for the entire region. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
I also want to say that we have to look forward to coming up with some kind of lessons, right? Lessons to be learned 10 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring in this very important part of the world, this very blessed yet very troubled part of the world, the Middle East and the Arab world. What lessons can be learned? What lessons can be learned from the six Arab Spring countries, the five that did not, succeed to have a smooth and peaceful transition to democratization and reform, and the one unique example of success, which is Tunisia. What lessons can be learned? I believe there are a number of lessons there. Number one, I believe the importance of filling the vacuum in civil society. Up till now, we have vacuum in civil society in many of these countries. We don't have actual, activism at the civil society level. We don't have real freedom of expression or freedom of the press. We don't have real opposition movements which are organized and able to come together and build alliances and coalitions. And that is a major hurdle to any form of transition to democratization in a peaceful and successful way. This is one very important lesson. The second lesson, as I said, the idea of easy to oust a dictator, but what do you do next? If you don't have a vision and if you don't have a roadmap, then it's very easy for somebody else, whether it is the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it is the military, whether it's any other group or party, to take away your democratic experience and to derail it in a completely negative or bad direction, which is not really desirable or not something that has been planned or wished for by the protesters and activists in the first place. And another important lesson is the role of the media and the role of social media and digital media in particular. We need to adopt a middle ground of informed, intelligent, and smart balance, a middle ground of cyber realism, so to speak. We don't want to fall into the trap of technological determinism or overcrediting social media with the role in the transformations or building the transformations, calling them Facebook revolution or Twitter uprising. And we also don't want to overlook or diminish the role either and to just say, oh, they're not important, they did not do anything, we should not credit them. We need to be cyber realistic. In other words, to realize their own pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages, strengths and weaknesses, potentials and limitations.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you so much for joining us today, Sahar.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Next on the program, we'll be talking to Ibrahim Jalal about Yemen. Ibrahim is an independent Yemen and Gulf analyst, a non-resident scholar at MEI, and a co-founder of the Security Distillery think tank. Ibrahim, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Pleasure to be with you.
The Arab Spring protests in Yemen followed shortly after those in Egypt, beginning at the end of January 2011. At that time, Yemen's president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, had been in power for more than 30 years. Ibrahim, how much of an impact did what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt have on events in Yemen, and what was the atmosphere like at the time?
The Arab Spring uprising that began with Bouazizi in Tunisia and then went to Tahrir Square in Egypt did absolutely give a wake-up call to the populations in Yemen. The population of youth was inspired to voice out their concerns. The opposition, mainly the joint meeting parties, were waiting for such a moment to level up their demands in the political landscape. And that technically triggered the long accumulated issues throughout the time of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. So the local conditions were ready. They just needed something to amplify that and bring it to the fore. Living costs were on an increase, levels of unemployment were soaring, grievances. We've had an armed rebellion in 24, and that continued to drag, and then another revival of the Southern sentiment. So we had wide range of grievances in the country. And with that kleptocratic governance of the Zaidi Highland elite, it just amplified until we had a political deadlock in 2009 that the parliamentary elections were called off and never happened again. The atmosphere on the ground, was a mix of optimism for reforms as an idea, and fear of what if that pursuit fails. The ruling elite reproduction and the means and ways to co-opt the uprising. And then we had revolutions and counter-revolutions, demonstrations in Change Square and counter-demonstrations in the 70th Square. and mobilization and counter mobilization. And all that eventually, left Yemen in a black and white scenario, as we can see today.
Ibrahim, moving ahead to Yemen's National Dialogue Conference, which ran from the spring of 2013 to the beginning of 2014, do you think it could have led to a different outcome?
The National Dialogue Conference was a fantastic experience. It was one of the most, if not the most inclusive dialogue processes. It brought people from a wide range of spectrum to the table. But at the same time, it wouldn't have led anywhere had the security challenges been contained. So at the time of the national dialogue, we had the Houthis intensifying their military campaigns in Jawf, in Amran, and elsewhere. And all these were sending clear messages, is that the national dialogue is being convened in the capital, but all security indicators outside the capital indicate there is a whole lot of threats facing the process, the utility of arms versus dialogue. And had these been contained, the national dialogue would have been the right step, to address accumulating grievances, whether it's regarding the southern cause or the Sa'da issue or the Tahami cause or multiple other issues such as women empowerment and youth involvement. And then we had, by the end of the National Dialogue Conference, the idea to reform the constitution and reimagine the Yemeni social contract. Had it been more equitable, it might have been, and only if the security challenges were contained. Looking back, it was a golden chance, but now it's missed.
Looking back on things now, with the benefit of hindsight a decade on, what do you see as the long-term ramifications and legacy of the Arab Spring in Yemen?
The Arab Spring as a phenomena, as a cross-border phenomena, remains very controversial, whether in Yemen, Libya, or Syria. And that debate who bears what responsibility for the damage that has been happening to these countries is yet to be part of the past. The ramifications are multifaceted. At the regional level, you see changing regional security dynamics and how certain actors changed the way they could intervene. Before the Arab Spring, it was hard to imagine the UAE engaging in direct military interventions to advance a wide range of interests, or even the Saudis, given that the last military intervention they had was long time ago. And with that comes, more regional ambitions that are reflected on the Yemeni situation, and that will continue to play out in the next one to 2 decades. And the third perception has been also changing with these security dynamics. You have the issue of Muslim Brotherhood. You have the Houthis. Before the campaign of the Arab coalition, the Houthis were not as much of a concern. During the campaign, they have been the primary concern, but they have not been the only concern. And the Yemeni landscape generally has been an opportunity for other major powers, such as Russia, for example, trying to hedge its bets to increase its influence and footprint in the region more broadly. But internally, as for Yemen, one of the long-term ramifications is that people now question the idea of authoritarian stability versus full-scale chaos. So talking to many people, why did we start this in 2011? Should we not be able to drive the process forward? And that, is a source of concern as well. You have now with the conflict, the levels of inequality and oppression that were major sources of concern in the past decade now have been only deepening and widening to scales that one did not imagine in the past decade. So this, as a result, deepens divisions among the Yemeni social fabric, the political elite, and most importantly, downgraded the struggle for a more just, prosper, and democratic Yemen. The only concern with this, or one of the many concerns instead, is the dominance of people with arms on the political landscape. And these will be long-term issues that define and redefine alignments and realignments. The possibility of implementing peace agreements or using these to keep Yemen stuck and stalled in a cycle of conflict. And this is quite concerning.
Given everything that you just described, the ongoing conflict, the loss of tens of thousands of lives, the world's worst humanitarian disaster as it's been widely described, do you think a political transition in Yemen is possible anytime soon?
I mean, a political transition is possible, but a stable, implementable political transition, given rivalries and incompatible aspirations for Yemen and the things you mentioned, I think a stable political transition is not possible under current conditions. And the major concern for Yemenis is that, you can pressure and put credible international push for a transition, but whether it proves sustainable and useful for the political trajectory, that's another question.
Taking a step back to look at the situation more broadly, what do you see as the most pressing challenges facing the country today?
I mean, one of the most major concerns is, of course, the rising level of poverty, the humanitarian need, the unemployment, the declining purchasing power. These are all alarming and they reflect on day to day people's ability to live. And with these challenges, people look for other ways to life, including two-day fights. And that's heartbreaking because economic opportunities are absent and instead getting restructured in the hands of a few. If you look at the Houthi held areas, it's just a few families enjoying the wealth, while the great share of populations in the northwest are suffering, and equally in other regions as well, but much less. And then the other alarming trend that we're seeing now is the proliferation of militias and heavy arms. And these in peace processes turn to be spoilers, but also to the legitimate future aspirations of disarmament and the integration of these to form a viable and a modern Yemeni state that delivers the Arab Spring motives: better opportunities, equal citizenship, social justice, addressing and reversing grievances. And the third aspect is, of course, the fragmentation of the country. Now, Yemen, more than ever before, has deep divisions and the enmity and competition between forces who might have an idea of what a better Yemen looks like is not being perceived as manageable. And that's exactly the setback in the Republican forces. If one could define one angle of the current struggle in 2021 as an attempt by the ancestors of imamates to make a comeback, but as well the remaining Republican forces trying to save the remaining of the collapsing Yemeni Republic. And the final thing is, of course, the peace process. We need more concessions. We need dialogue. But dialogue alone cannot move forward. You need military pressure, credible military pressure that brings parties out of necessity, not by applying a pressure on one party while trying to put incentives for the other. Because peace is not the result of just dialogue between a weak and a strong party. And that's what results in an imbalanced situation like what it is now. Externally, I think there is a huge disconnect between the international views of how the peace process should move forward. The way it's projected in America, according to President Joe Biden, is, suspending maybe arms to the Saudi-led coalition or curtailing American support to the offensive. But this is just the technical aspect. And the leading causes to why the conflict started are internal. Without addressing these and acknowledging them, I think there is a huge disconnect. And that takes me to the second point, which gives more space for regional actors to intervene and exploit the process and adapt it to their interests given that they have control over some partners or proxies or even stakeholders. And the final external concern is to continue projecting Yemen as a humanitarian crisis per se, because the humanitarian crisis is a result of political and security crises that have been happening over the past decade. So to address the humanitarian crisis and mitigate it and reverse this trend, the political and security issues should be resolved. Without that, I am afraid that it will continue to exacerbate, just like what we've seen after Stockholm. Today, Marib is on the brink of displacing more than 2 million IDPs, should the Houthi campaign continue, of course. So these internal and external issues present some of the most pressing challenges for Yemen and in Yemen.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
I think whenever we think about the Arab Spring, we have to be reminded that the change is a long-term process. Revolts don't necessarily succeed from the first attempt. The 1962 revolution in Yemen was a result of several thwarted revolts that started a decade and a half ago. And if you look even outside Yemen, it took the French almost 10 years to storm the Bastille. Yemen, Syria, and Libya, by looking at the situation now, it just gets more messy. So should the aspirations to aspire for a better and a more just and equitable power sharing of these in these countries, I think the struggle is not over. And for what it is now and what we've been experiencing over the past decade in specific, we have to believe that, there will be a day when the sun will eventually rise and answer the demands of the people.
We'll have to leave things there. But thank you so much for joining us on the program, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Alistair.
In the last segment of our program today, we'll be speaking to Karam Shaar about Syria. Karam is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute's Syria program and the lead researcher at the Orient Policy Center. Karam, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
While there were sporadic protests in Syria starting as early as the end of January 2011, major unrest really began on March 15th, the so-called Day of Rage, when protesters marched in Damascus and Aleppo demanding reforms and the release of political prisoners. Karam, while the domino effect of the Arab Spring across the region no doubt played a significant role in helping to spark the protests in Syria, what do you see as the underlying root causes?
Well, I actually think you're exactly right. People in Syria were keeping an eye on what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt primarily. And we were all excited, especially younger people. And I think what sets what happened in Syria apart from what happened in many other countries is that that was an uprising of the middle class. It was not really because people were starving. It's not a revolution of the hungry. People just needed more freedoms. They needed the ability to set their own political parties. They were facing oppression on daily basis. And what they expected initially in the early days of the uprising was a much more lenient response from the Syrian government. What they were faced with was just unprecedented brutality that people did not think could actually happen. And that kept fueling the uprising day in and day out. And within just maybe 2 months, people in Syria knew that this is not going to end well. I would say by April or May, Bashar al-Assad lost maybe half of his supporters. And after that, maybe in the following 2 years, he kept losing some of his popularity, and then it just stayed on. Now the situation is like it's a deadlock, and the share of people on either side has kind of stabilized.
In 2011, most Syrians had never known anything other than the rule of the Assad family, either under Hafez or his son Bashar, and the wall of fear must have been huge. When did it become real for you what was happening, and what was that like?
I still remember watching Bashar al-Assad's speech in Syria's parliament, the People's Council, in late March 2011. So that was 15 days after the major protests started in Dara, and a few smaller ones started in Aleppo. I actually took place in those ones in Aleppo. So I was among the very early organizers of those protests. And I still remember watching Bashar al-Assad's disappointing speech in a textiles factory where I used to work and study at the same time as a textiles weaver. And I still remember Bashar al-Assad just trying to say that this is just a conspiracy against Syria because Syria is the only country standing against Israel in the Middle East, and that protesters are being supported by external governments and so on. It was then when I realized that that's not going to end well. It will be terrible. And a few weeks later, I remember in a protest in Aleppo, in the heart of the city, in the neighborhood of Al Jamiliyah, I remember shouting, "People want the downfall of the regime." That shouting was just so liberating. I knew that's not going to end well because I used to walk in those streets for years when I used to go to school. And in that protest, I remember my brother, I remember someone actually tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Oh, hey, Abu Adib." In Syria, we call each other by the name of our father. So we say, "You're the son of Adib." So he was calling me, "Hey, Abu Adib." And I turned my head around only to realize that that was actually my brother. We were all my siblings were actually protesting, and we were not telling each other because we were afraid that this might be way too risky, yet we accepted to take the risk ourselves.
What did the Syrian uprising mean for you on a personal level?
I think the negative impacts have been so enormous. I sometimes feel, had all the bad things happened over a shorter time period, I could have gone crazy. The good thing is that our expectations were being conditioned over time, so we knew what's going to happen. We started to expect what's going to happen. So for me, I grew up in a house that we restored when I was a child with my father. After he returned from the UK, he was obsessed with houses. And so we returned to Aleppo, and he bought this house from the Ottoman era, and we renovated it. And that was bombed by a barrel bomb in during the uprising. I had to leave the country because of fears over being arrested for organizing protests. My very own family that used to live in Aleppo actually now lives in Canada, the United States, Germany, Hungary, and I live here in New Zealand. So that same family is scattered all around the world. The negative impacts are just sometimes are really difficult to understand. But on the other hand, I'm actually not that pessimistic. I feel that there was a price that we had to pay, and that tomorrow is definitely better. If you just look at the share of countries that transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, you can see very clearly that there are many ups and downs. However, the trend is definitely upward. And Syria is no exception. If we think about it in the bigger context, I don't think Syria is actually different from any of those other countries. That was going to happen at some stage because you could not uproot a regime like the Syrian regime without a cost. I'm happy we actually started that. Hopefully, our children or our grandchildren will benefit from the freedoms that are to come.
Following up on that and kind of looking back in a big picture sense, a decade on, what do you see as the long-term ramifications and legacy of the Arab Spring in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly as I said. So if you think of other countries in the region and you look how stable they seem to be, think of Iran, think of other Gulf states. I actually think they haven't started the process of dealing with their problems yet. In Syria, we have. We have started that process, and it's very, very costly. However, there was no other way around it. And this response from the Syrian regime, I think, is going to be similar to the response of, say, the Iranian regime or the Saudi regime when they realize that they're indeed threatened. Luckily, we have started that. In some other countries, it did not start yet, but I just see it as inevitable.
Looking at Syria today, from the number of people displaced to the worsening economic crisis, the situation is dire. What, in your view, are the most pressing problems facing the country?
Perhaps I'm saying this because I'm an economist, but I actually think the most pressing issue in Syria is people's livelihoods. The number of people who are food insecure in 2021 is around 9 million out of just 17 million who are still in the country, as many people fled. The number of people living in absolute poverty is on the rise. And I think the situation has never been this bad throughout the war, even though the pace of hostilities has slowed down significantly. And I think this is primarily because Bashar al-Assad is not willing to compromise, and his backers, primarily Iran and Russia, are simply refusing to keep just supporting him endlessly without seeing any genuine gains from that intervention. People keep portraying the al-Assad regime as an outright puppet in the hands of Russia and Iran, and I happen to strongly disagree with that. But yeah, back to your question, I think the most pressing thing is people's livelihoods. The second thing I think is security. And unfortunately, the security situation hasn't been deteriorating, but it just started from a very bad base. It was very different. It was very bad, and it continues to be bad over the past few years. While the case for the economic crisis is quite different. Throughout the years of the war, the situation was actually considerably better compared to the deterioration over the past 2 years.
On February 24th, a court in Germany convicted a former Syrian secret police officer of aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. Do you think this is cause for optimism? And what do you think the prospects are more broadly that those guilty of committing such crimes in Syria will be brought to justice, even if it's belatedly and in a sort of roundabout way like this?
Yeah, I mean that's an incredibly difficult question. I think it just depends on how we define justice. So if you think of other dictators who were indeed promised not to be persecuted for their time in office, think of Pinochet, for example, in Chile, and that simply did not happen. People just went and found loopholes and tried to bring him back to justice, from the UK to Spain, back to Chile. And if you focus more on Syria, I think we should never forget what happened with Adib Shishakli. Adib Shishakli in the early 50s led a military campaign against Jabal Druze, and he killed some people, but never to a scale similar to what Bashar al-Assad has done. And yet he basically said, I am not willing to drag the country into civil war. And he decided to leave and go to live in exile in Brazil. Someone from Sweden went to Brazil and killed him while he's there. Think of Bashar al-Assad. Think what's going to happen to him given the scale of what he has done. I think even if there's no formal justice from al-Assad and his clan, there will be some form of justice where people take matters into their own hands and just retaliate for what happened. Unfortunately, I do not think what has happened so far will go without any form of justice.
Looking ahead, how do you see the situation developing going forward? Given everything that's happened, do you think it's possible to put things to rights in Syria? And if so, what would that look like?
Unfortunately, I don't see Bashar al-Assad budging in the current parameters. I think what he's doing currently is perfectly rational. He's basically facing two options. One of them is just considerably worse than the other. The first is the sanctions. The second is accepting transition of power. He knows that if he accepts any form of reconciliation, even with the opposition, he will end up out of office in a few years. He's not a popular leader, and he knows that very well. This is exactly why Bashar al-Assad is refusing to compromise, refusing to do anything in the talks of, say, Astana or the constitutional talks and so on. And given that, I think something else needs to be done, a different policy response to the deadlock that's happening in the country. If things continue to be this way, the only hope we have is that Russia and Iran will basically just say, you know what? It's not that we're no longer willing to help you economically. We're actually pulling out. We just can't wait and keep hemorrhaging forever just for you. At least, if not for Russia, which is basically paying its forces there, for Iran, because they're being bombed almost every other day these days by Israel. I think our hope at the moment is on Bashar al-Assad's backers to exert more pressure on him to get him to change his behavior, but we cannot count on he himself changing anytime soon.
We'll have to leave things there, but thank you so much for joining the program today, Karam.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes our program for this week. I'd like to thank all of the guests who joined us for this special program. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.